Great.
Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome to the latest in the Insight series online. It's great to be joined by many of you that have been with us before, and thank you to all those that are joining us for the first time. Now, at Miller Knoll, we're proud of our heritage of research going back over many years. And here's a quote from one of our former presidents of the Herman Miller Research Group, and I'm pretty sure Rex is going to be quoting this guy, Robert Probst, and he wrote this in 1968, that human organizations have always been natural places of change, reflecting the organic nature of life. What is different now is the pace of change and the prospect that it will come faster and faster. Wow, what an amazing quote, could have been written yesterday. We're going to learn a little bit more about change today as we're joined by Rex Mueller, and Rex leads mindSHIFT, a futures research and consulting firm that specializes in solving complex business challenges in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry. He started his career as a project manager in the architecture and construction department for Southwestern Bell, and any of you that know AT&T, that is now what they are called, in 1978, which is the year that I got married. He's worked as an owner, a manufacturer, a distributor, a subcontractor, and he's an expert consultant. And his background gives Rex a unique insight to the current and the future challenges that owners and providers face. So I'm really looking forward to today's session. Rex, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Herman Miller. One little trivia, Mark, that you may not know, back in 1978, Southwestern Bell was Herman Miller's third largest client behind Texas Instruments. I'm not sure who was number two. So a lot of the foundations, and we'll be going back to Robert Probst, were established during this seminal transition period coming out of what we might call that industrial post-war economy into an information economy. And that's what Robert Probst was really writing and trying to solve for. But now we're at another crossroads, a historical nexus point that if we get this right, we can reestablish some of the principles that Robert Probst saw that was important for work in this new changing world. So the question is, what is the future of work? And I'll be referencing some drivers of change, and it's a huge topic. So I'm going to focus primarily on technological drivers of a digital era, and we're going to narrow in on that. But I think the most significant question for today is that with 2 years of our employees having built different rhythms and patterns, and they value things differently, if your people are different, is your culture? Which then brings me to, hold on here, there we go, brings to one of the research projects we did in 2014 that led to a research around changing space to change culture. How can we make change more agile and tune it better to the individuals in the organization? And when you think about designing new space, what you're really asking is, how do we want to live and work better together? So that's an important part or lens that we sometimes forget in our tactical approach to doing block planning and test fits and all of those other things, working with standardization. We really need to be solving for, how do we want to work and live better together? And that question is no more important than today because of what we've gone through in the past 2 years. Now, this is just a reference of some of the research, and the unique research that our organization does is that we bring stakeholders, approximately 100 to 130 different industry leaders and subject matter experts, to tackle big issues, whether it is the dysfunction of project delivery, whether it is the challenge of engagement and culture in workplaces, or health and well-being. And we've also done the same with the same stakeholders that focus on education, on turning the education machine into a more human, individualistic experience, moving from the best 19th century education that the Western world does to 21st century learning. And then this middle book on mental health, well-being, trauma for caregivers. The third item was something that I worked with Dr. Jernigan on, and he is a clinical psychologist that specializes in mass disaster recovery and trauma. We built this workbook specifically for the pandemic, and at the end, you'll have a coupon code and you'll be able to download the digital version of this for free. So let's start out with the driver of change. In 1964, Gordon Moore, one of the co-founders of Intel, made a statement that he believed that the computing power of the microchip would continue to double every 18 to 24 months at approximately the same cost. Well, what is the implication of that? The implications are profound, and we're still experiencing those implications. What it meant is that information was going to continue to double at the same rate. This was the problem set that Robert Probst was solving for in 1968. He saw the implications that information would be overwhelming. It would be continually new or fluid. It would have a short shelf life. And therefore, the environment that we're in constrains our ability to adapt and adjust to these new kinds of demands that information has on us. And this was all happening in the late 1960s into the 1970s. And then the environment he envisioned was a very organic environment. And now we can look back in retrospect and see what happened to his vision of this highly organic, fluid, easy to change, collaborative environment when we began to tether it and we began to look at it as a means of cutting cost and efficiency. And so we have an opportunity to revisit the original principles of creating an environment that could adapt to the demands of today. And now more than ever, we've seen the implications of not being nimble and not being able to change rapidly in real time. Now, what Robert Probst was working with is a shift in management philosophy too, because at the same time in the 1950s, individuals like Abraham Maslow were laying the foundations for what we're now seeing the fruit of his work, which was this empowerment or self-actualization of the individual. And what he found is that every individual has this innate sense that they're with that senses what they're being. And his statement was what an individual is capable of becoming, what they envision, they must drive towards that in order to find satisfaction and happiness. This is in contrast to the left image with Frederick Taylor, who basically designed philosophy that fueled Ford Motor Company and other industrial, where managers did the thinking and then the workers did the work. So we were seeing this shift taking place, but even today, most of the leaders were raised and trained in the Frederick Taylor side of KPIs and siloed departments and breaking things down into their component parts, not looking at things as systems with a nature behind those systems and patterns, and understanding organizations through that systems lens. Then we move up to 1973 when I first went to college, and I read Alvin Toffler's book, Future Shock, and it was earth-shaking for me. And he basically said that the rate and pace of information and change was so rapid that there would be a psychic breakdown, a psychological breakdown in individuals and society at some point in time. Now let's look at the implications of what's been happening. Look again, around the 1960s, 1964, when Gordon Moore and the Intel chip was invented, the average lifespan of an S&P 500 company was 60 years. And you can see that it's continued to decline until it's now under 15 years. The reason is that change externally is more rapid than change internally. And so these companies cease to exist after 15 years, and it's continuing that pace. And we all know these famous companies that were icons that when I grew up, I could never imagine that they would not be number one on the list. And even Whole Foods, it was 13 years after Whole Foods went public before they were purchased by Amazon. My favorite story is Kodak and this whole part of the digital technology. Now, part of this for me is interesting because my dad worked for a rival company. He got his degree in Rochester at RIT, where most of Kodak's executives and engineers, but he went a different route and worked for a company called Fuji. So I saw this in Technicolor or Kodachrome color growing up. Kodak was an icon. They made their money through processing. The film was kind of a giveaway so that they could get the processing. But in 1976, they invented the very first digital camera. But what they didn't know and didn't appreciate is the compounding effect of Moore's law, that information would be doubling. Now, at the time they invented the camera, the resolution was only 56 kilobytes. Think of that, kilobytes. Your cell phone probably has 10 megapixels. And so if you compound and look at the rates of change, in 1993, Casio came out with the very first viable consumer product. And by that time, Kodak was dead in the water, even though it took another 15 years for them to go into bankruptcy. The writing was already on the wall. They could not catch up because they didn't watch that growth curve of technology. Now, the individual who has developed a process of understanding when technologies hit these inflection points is Ray Kurzweil, and this is the Kurzweil curve. I've met Ray a few times. He's a fascinating individual. And what he's projecting is that at certain points in time, when technology continues to hit what we call this hockey stick rate of growth, it stays invisible underground, and it's like compounding a penny. If I give you $1 million today, or give you the option of taking a penny compounded for 30 days, most kids in school, when I give this test to, they pick the $1 million. However, it stays invisible until day 28. At day 28, you're at $625,000, so you would be better off with the million. But at day 29, it doubles, and day 30, it doubles. So that's the part we miss. And part of research and development needs to be watching technologies when they hit their hockey stick curve, and watching technologies that are parallel, such as biotech and information technology, or energy and transportation. And when these technologies converge, then you have something that happened that we're all familiar with in 2007. You have an iPhone that completely disrupts. So this has been the driver of change, but our organizations haven't been able to adapt and keep up with this. Now, if we look at the construction industry, if you look at the green line that's going upwards, that is the productivity increases of labor in non-agricultural industries since 1964. If we look at the other lines, those are different areas of construction: residential, industrial, commercial, and you can see they've stayed flat and declined. And this is what we addressed in the book, The Commercial Real Estate Revolution. And part of that is because these industries were designed to solve complicated problems, but today we live in a complex era. And getting to the root nature of what drives a system is part of solving for complexity. Putting the pieces together and finding how the pieces best fit is part of solving for complicated issues. And I want to move us into the kind of leadership problems we need to adapt to. Now, there's a new kind of leadership style that was developed by Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky out of Harvard called adaptive leadership. And quite simply, this new level of leadership solves for complexity. However, we've been trained in solving for two kinds of problems. I like to call them light bulb problems. Now, a light bulb problem is a problem where you have a known problem with a range of known solutions. So, for example, one day at the house, one of the lights went out in the laundry room. And my wife said, could you go to Home Depot, one of our hardware stores, and find a light bulb? And I said, sure, no problem. Well, little did I know that I went unequipped. I got to Home Depot and there was a whole rack of multiple kinds of light bulbs, daylight, bright light, different wattages. And so solving for this problem, you call an expert. And so I called my wife. I said, honey, specifically, which light bulb would you like? And she told me. So most of the problems we have to solve for every day, logistical problems, return to office, safety, air quality, all of those are what we call light bulb or technical problems. Very important, but we have ways of understanding and getting to the root of those problems, and we have a range of solutions for those problems. The second kind of problem we have to solve for are directional. When the environment shifts and we need to move in a different course, leaders need to be able to establish a new course, a new vision of why we're changing, where we're headed. And then the major skill is casting that vision, creating alignment, reshifting priorities and resources. We've been trained in these two very well. These are the kinds of problems we take. But what Marty Linsky and Ronald Heifetz say that when we use these methodologies for complex problems, we create short-term solutions that create unintended negative consequences or the ripple effect inside. And essentially what happens is that these kinds of problems don't stick. So if you look at change initiatives, we know that 70 to 90% of change initiatives fail. And these are all the organizations that have done the research. The reason, again, is that the primary impediment to change is culture. Culture are complex webs, networks of communication, networks of collaboration, networks of cooperation, networks of trust. Those are all very complex and they're human-based. So when we take this very either strategic or tactical, eight steps to change, communication strategies, these fail and they don't stick because we're not dealing with the fundamental issue of change, which is culture. What happens are we build what I call sandcastle solutions. They look beautiful and they may remain intact as long as that leader is in place, as long as that program is being funded. But we've all seen when things go south, certain things like research and development or other areas begin to get cut because we move back into these tactical and strategic issues, not seeing the impact to culture. So the adaptive problems that we face today are when we come to the end of what's working but have no bridge to the other side. This is when we need the new style of leadership, adaptive leader. And an adaptive leader is really walking a tightrope between competing agendas, competing interests, fears, insecurities, volatility, all of these things. A leader needs to be solid internally. Most of the work of adaptive leadership is internal to the leader. Clarity about their vision, clarity about the values of why we're doing this, the ability to withstand sabotage, and the ability to build coalitions, the ability to do discovery learning, to not have the answers and be comfortable with not having the answers, but being comfortable with saying, let's explore, experiment, and change. This is challenging, and most leaders aren't trained with this. And then when the stress stressors come in, they fall back to what they're comfortable with. So let's look at the culture eats strategy dynamic that Peter Drucker talked about. Now, what he was really talking about are two different kinds of culture. Our organization helps companies look at four kinds of culture. First is the aspirational culture, typically your mission, vision, values. That happens once in a while in a company. Then we have what we call the legacy culture. The legacy culture is what made you successful up to now, but will constrain you from growing and changing in the future. Then the third kind of culture is what we call the outliers, the positive outliers that give us a hint of what our new, better version of ourselves could be. Most of the time, those individuals don't last in the company because of legacy culture. And then the third is what we call the shadow culture. This is invisible to management. These are all the workarounds, the tacit agreements, the way people have figured out how to get things done in the organization that the processes and procedures don't support. And over time, this shadow culture can become a negative impediment to change. I've come up with a very simple definition of culture. It's what happens when you're not there. That's it. It's the invisible attitudes, habits, values, and behaviors that run the place when we're not there. So now we need a mechanism and means to surface those, surface the shadow culture and to change it. Design and space are the most effective vehicles for uncovering those shadow behaviors and attitudes and begin to disrupt or dislodge that legacy behavior into new kinds of behaviors. And I will end the presentation with a story that is a prototypical story of how to do it well. Now, one of the individuals that I admire who was a colleague of mine is Todd Bollinger. A lot of the work on adaptive leadership is very academic. Todd has written a highly accessible book called Tempered Resilience on the leadership approach when you're going through fundamental culture change. Now, I will let you know that it's through the lens, it's a faith-based perspective. And so if that is an impediment to your reading it, I appreciate that and understand. But for me, this has been a highly accessible book, easy to understand, and for a lot of leaders, diving into the academic work on adaptive leadership is a challenge. So George Welch kind of sums it up. If the rate of change outside exceeds the rate of change inside, the end is near. And for the past 2 years, things have been going so fast and so rapid. We're still trying to catch up to ourselves. We're still making projections and predictions that we have to step away from, that we're going to open in the spring, or when the vaccine comes, this is going to happen. And we just don't know. And we've got to take a different approach to how we're trying to address these volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous challenges. So let's revisit Robert Probst. Robert Probst had a vision. His vision was to capitalize or empower the management philosophy that Douglas McGregor developed as Theory Y. It was a counterbalance to Frederick Taylor's management philosophy of Theory X. Theory Y was to empower the individual, find the intrinsic motivation levels built on Maslow, and Robert Probst had designed an environment around 8 fundamental design criteria that helped us accomplish this. But what's happened is we've turned the environment into these efficient little boxes that don't fit humans and are dehumanizing at their best. We have a new opportunity. The pandemic's taken us off the treadmill. We have a way of rethinking what we're doing and coming back with new philosophies. Now, this is Dr. Martin Seligman on the left and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. One of the new elements that is beginning to work its way into management is positive psychology. And these are the two founders of positive psychology in the late 1990s. Dr. Seligman is at the University of Pennsylvania. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is at the University of Chicago. You may know Mihai Csikszentmihalyi because of his book called Flow, and you may know Dr. Seligman because of his work on post-traumatic growth and his book Flourish. These two individuals have transformed, along with Gallup, and looking at organizations and managements by playing to people's strengths instead of trying to fix weaknesses. And I think this gives us a new piece to the puzzle that Robert Probst was putting together, capitalizing on what I'm using as a working term called Theory F. So we had Theory X, which was command and control leadership. We had Theory Y, which is motivational management. But now Theory F is the management philosophy on flourishing and thriving and healthy organizations. So we have these elements that we can put together. So I'd like to end with a story that's a prototypical story of leadership doing it well. During the real estate crash in 2008, CBRE lost 90% of its market value in the stock market. Lou Horn, who is the president of Southern California for CBRE, came back out of this and said, in order for us to survive, we have to become a different kind of organization. The old model and the old attitudes and habits, and think about shadow culture here, of the superstar broker, the franchise player, bringing it in and then serving that kind of entitlement culture. We have to end that. We have to build a more team culture. We've got 5 different market divisions here that don't talk to each other. We've got industrial, we've got commercial, we've got retail, we've got institutional. None of them talk to each other. Legal and accounting don't talk to each other, but they all have valuable knowledge that we need to leverage. And the organization was on board and they say, yes, team-based. And then he said, the implication of that is we need to change our space. We need to go from 70% private offices, where brokers had 15 by 15 private offices and all their trophies, images of themselves at an Eric Clapton concert with backstage passes, silver shovels, all of that, and a gatekeeper. We need to jettison all of that in favor of an open, fluid environment. That's where shadow culture came in. So instead of forcing it down their throats, instead of coming in with, quote, experts telling them why it's good for them, he said, let's go on a journey of discovery. Lou said, I don't know what the solution is, but I believe we can do this together. He divided the company. He took 25% of the office employees, divided them into 8 different research groups around technology, around culture, around amenities, around design, around health and well-being, and put them to work and empowered them to do the research and come back. And on Fridays, they would share the results of the research. He took the most skeptical people and they went on a journey. They went up to Google and they looked at their environment and came back and said, no, we don't want to be Google. We're not going to be in t-shirts and blue jeans. But then they went to Amsterdam and saw Eneco and saw the environment of the high energy in the open space with a cafeteria. They liked the energy. Then they went to Bloomberg in New York City, where Bloomberg sat in the middle in a very open area, and they saw the buzz and the commotion. And the final closer for them is when they went up to Seattle to see the Russell 2000 folks, and saw these very well-paid, highly paid individuals in their suits with a completely open environment. When they came back, what they decided and what Lou was hoping for was to get at least flip it from 70% private offices to 30%. what the group decided is we only need one private office. This is what adaptive leadership does. And they knew that one of the biggest challenges to the brokers was going to have to give up their files. They put all of their files in the cloud. Now, remember, this is 2010, 2011. For a 40 to 50 to 60-year-old broker, the word putting my files in the cloud would give you heart palpitations. But what they did is to manage that transition by hiring them digital coaches. One of the biggest adversaries to Lou told me that he is a better broker because of that. That is the kind of change management that we're looking for. So if you want to find me, you can find me on LinkedIn or rex@rexmiller.com. And then Mark is going to give you a link to download the copy of Strategy in Rebuilding. And then I'll be open for questions.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Just to let people know, there was one question about, you've referenced so many books, any chance of a reading list in the follow-up email? But what an easier one might be the fact that you're going to share, we're sharing the slide deck so that they can take a look at them in the slide deck.
Absolutely. Yes. And I've got a pretty vast reading list you can see behind me here. So depending on the topic, I'm happy to provide. And again, you can reach me on LinkedIn or at my email, and I'm happy to provide whatever reading list you're interested in.
Okay. A question that's come in to me is, open plan still seems to get a bit of a kicking. What impact do you think the pandemic will have on open plan design?
Well, so open plan is neutral. It's neither good nor bad. So when we look at what works, part of what we have to do is take the Lou Horn discovery process. So it first has to fit the business model. So open plan solves certain problems better than others. So you want to look at what problems are you trying to solve. You want to look at the workflow. You want to be able to understand, does it fit the culture we have? And so first of all, you have to do those inventories. The one size fits all, the coming up with the universal standards, that doesn't work because every location, every office has a different context. Taking a stakeholder approach to discovery, to working through the problem, and then experimentation and prototyping is the way to solve that. So the open plan question is, it depends. I've seen it work wonderfully. And then I've seen revolts. You know, I went to one company that built a beautiful environment, open plan, but these were engineers that were coming out of dingy, dark offices with 80-inch high panels. And they preferred that to this windows and open, but it was because there was no conditioning, change, shift, dialogue, experimentation in the process.
Which I think is interesting when it brings to the question that Matt Margetts has asked is, hasn't the debate actually moved from open plan to basically task-based environments? That it's, like you've just said, it's dependent on the task you're doing.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And again, the biggest shift for these is, I can remember back in 1980, when we were moving executives at Southwestern Bell out of their private offices into 80-inch high cubicles. And I had one individual look at me with a very sad face. And he said, when I first came to Southwestern Bell after the war, we were all in oak desks in a bullpen, open bullpen. He said, I've worked hard over 30 years, and I finally got my private office with my walnut desk and my executive chair. And now I'm being asked to move out of that into an 80-inch high cubicle with rift cut oak. And so the message was telling him, I'm being thrown back to the very beginning again. I'm losing all my status. I'm losing what I worked hard for. we missed that piece to the story. That was back in 1980. That had such an impact on me that I never lost track of what people go through and how to help condition them to change.
Yeah, and Matt, yes, we did used to do walnut cubicles. I can promise you that. So how can one go, this is from Suzanne, how can one go about to try and impact our leaders just to be more adaptive?
Well, so that's a hard one because we always talk about, unless you have leadership support, it's a sandcastle. But what you can do, and what we've worked on is, and we're working with an organization right now on helping them develop a strategy, and we call it leading from the second chair. How do you lead from the second chair? We have a whole chapter on it in the book, The Healthy Workplace Nudge, because a lot of times these issues that we come up with, like health and well-being, they're leading edge topics that leaders aren't really fully aware of. So we're being informed, and part of it is finding a manager, a user group who believes in it, who gets it, who's willing to cash in some of their professional equity to do a prototype. So the magic words are test, prototype, research, and development. And that way it doesn't freak out the shadow culture, it doesn't freak out executives that we're doing something permanently. The other strategy that has worked is that you go to an environment, you go to a group that is struggling, and anything would be better than what they're going through now. And you ask to have an opportunity to work with them and better design a way to work together by changing space in order to do that.
Thank you. A question from Una. Is culture now distributed like the office? And why is everyone seem to be focused on redesigning the building?
Well, redesigning the building, again, the environment expresses what's important to you and why. So I think part of the challenge that we have, there's two challenges. One, if you don't have strong culture to begin with and you distribute people, then there's nothing that holds them together. A lot of times it was the common physical location that was the common bond. But culture now is more important than ever. The common values, why we do what we do, how we treat each other. Environments help define those new behaviors and patterns. And part of the new redesign is creating a new narrative on why we come to the office to begin with. We need to rethink, I believe we need to rethink the value proposition, because there are some things we can do together that we can't do separately. And we haven't made that case. What we've done is said, we're coming in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but Monday, Saturday, Monday, Friday. And I'm asking myself as an employee, why? Why am I coming in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? Now, if you said, we're going to do a certain kind of work, or we need everybody's input, so we're going to set these days where we come in to do that, that makes sense to me. I like what Brian Berthold with Cushman said. He said, in their research, they're finding that teams that have the ability to determine what works best for them, they have higher satisfaction rates than blanket statements from the organization, we're coming in or we're not. I think one of the big challenges leaders are facing is they're falling into two traps. One trap is to cave in. So this is remember the tightrope walker. You've got to make sure that you don't go to one extreme. One is caving in and letting people, you never have to come back again, do whatever you want, we love you. That's caving in. That's called failure of nerve in Todd Bollinger's book. Then the other is cracking down. If you don't come in, you're fired. If you don't do this, you're fired. Those help manage leadership anxiety, but they don't really address the problem. They just create they create a short term, we've got it fixed, I don't have to deal with it anymore, but they create a whole ripple effect of unintended consequences that are going to be hard to bring back into control.
Thank you. Another question here about culture. What do you think about the cultural lag between what we as individuals want from the workplace and the fact that the structure of work is often holding this back?
Well, in some degree, that's what work is, right? So a more specific question as to what you would like to see change would help me. But in some respects, I mean, I work for myself, but I still have constraints. I still have things that I have to do, and I can't do everything the way I want to. But what we need to find, and here's some research from Gallup, part of the challenge that we face is that our managers have been what we call task-oriented managers. They're very good at telling people, here's what I need you to do, here's how I need you to do it, and following up and make sure they do it. That's 82% of managers are highly competent in that area. Gallup says only 18% of managers are developmental. They have the soft skills naturally. That's where I think we've got the big divide. And the challenge there is that managers have been thrown into a new role that they've never had to have before. They have to be part life coaches, and they have to get the work done. So what we're seeing is a higher burnout level for managers. And then the challenge of how do we upskill them so they don't burn out and they don't disengage their employees, because under stress and pressure, these task-oriented managers just double down on getting it done and not reaching out. And in this environment with you and I, it's not as easy for me to read how you're doing, right? So I've got to be trained in, let's not get down to business right away. Let's spend a little bit of time in making sure Mark is doing well, life is okay, and I'm helping you navigate and strategize instead of just telling you what to do.
Thank you. Another question here. Should shadow culture be the driver of change? Should it only be used to streamline current systems? And how much should it be listened to?
Well, shadow culture is the elephant in the room. There's a TV show called Hell's Kitchen with Chef Ramsay. It's a good example. So in the dining room, where Chef Ramsay is schmoozing with the clients and making sure everybody feels loved and wonderful, that's what I would define as the aspirational culture. Back in the kitchen where they're screaming and yelling and crisis going, that's the shadow culture. That's what managers don't see. Shadow culture is kind of like the classroom when the teacher leaves the classroom and all the kids start acting up, and then the teacher shows back up again and everybody is in their chair. Classroom's a mess, but the teacher has no clue as to what happened. So first of all, we need to understand what is the shadow culture. What are the entitlements? And look at what do we want to weed out and what do we want to nurture and grow more. But in most cases, most leaders and managers have no clue what their shadow culture is.
Thank you. Another one here, which you may have expanded on a little already, but what are your thoughts on maintaining and evolving company culture in this hybrid world where not everyone's coming to a central common workplace? And does the physical space need to adapt more significantly than just open plan or cubicle conversation to meet the user experience post this moment in time?
Yeah, it's a great question. So GoDaddy is a good example of an organization that really looked at user experience through the lens of what a Four Seasons or Ritz-Carlton does with their guests. It's called client journey. And they looked at the day in the life of a GoDaddy employee for this new facility, and they looked at friction points along the way. Could be the parking lot, could be the reception area. And they rated those friction points as either, or those touch points as friction points, neutral points, or engagement points. One of the things they found is that one of the friction points is coming in and seeing a security guard at the reception station. They changed that so that it was a friendly greeting. They changed the role of their third-party facility support people, and they trained them in 4 Seasons training on recognizing body language and having budget and latitude to make somebody's day great. They were renamed experience managers. They upskilled them, found that they had higher retention rates, overall lower cost, much higher satisfaction, but helping reduce the stress. So at 10 feet, if Mark, you and I are walking down the hall and I'm part of the third party facility support, I'd be giving you eye contact at 10 feet and looking at, is Mark stressed or is he happy? And at 5 feet, I would give you a verbal greeting. And if you're stressed, I'd say, Mark, it looks like you've got a lot going on. Is there anything I can do to help you? You would say, I'm late for a meeting, but I've got to get this stuff printed out. And I would have the latitude to say, Mark, let me take that, get it printed out. It'll be at your desk when you get back. There's a lot we can do to look at client experience through the lens of all the touch points and all the people that we have in the environment that we're not taking advantage of. And again, another area is reducing stress is a new mandate in the workplace. And I feel that the secondary spaces are going to become primary. In other words, the connection space when we come in, you're stressed coming into the office, you need an opportunity to decompress a bit. So what's that going to be like? Meetings, you cannot go back-to-back meetings. You know, Microsoft's got a great image of brain scans of stress level of back-to-back meetings versus having a small break. So designing the scheduler, the conference room schedulers, that they're only 45-minute meetings and then we break. And then you've got like green rooms, like you do in presentation, areas where you can prep or recover. Then you've got different recovery zones. You've got non-technology solitude recovery zones. You've got non-technology social recovery zones. You've got heads down work zones. Recovery is the new secret to resiliency. We're finding that in sports. You know, you look at these kind of old athletes like Roger Federer and Tom Brady and other people having great careers. And a lot of that is because of the sleep and the recovery. So thinking through the health and well-being of employees in the environment is an opportunity that's new territory for us.
Thank you. Can I just clarify, when you talk about third party, you mean facility providers or software
Yes.
providers?
Yes. Yeah, like a CBRE or an ISS or somebody like that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. There's a kind of a question related to what you were just saying, but it takes it on its head a little bit. Jan is asking, in our new COVID reality, can you see how this culture and space change mindset might help adaptations in other sectors like hospitality and transport? Whereas I think what you were talking about is that we can learn from hospitality, but what can they learn from us?
Well, that's a great question, Mark. You know, I haven't thought much about I can tell you, I'm looking forward to when the hotels that I go to actually have all their services back. Many of the hotels are a bit Spartan. The food choices aren't great. You know, that's a good question. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question for hospitality.
Okay, thank you. Phil's said the question, spaces may change, but people struggle. Therefore, isn't it about autonomy and empowerment?
Well, that's what Douglas McGregor said in the 1950s. And that's what Robert Probst was trying to do too, provide a facility that allowed us to externalize our thinking, to easily have conversations and collaborate, to have control and autonomy. In education, at least in the States, there's something called project-based learning, where you create teams, you give them a problem, and then they can arrange the environment the way they need to do that particular study project. And, you know, for me, the model that comes closest to that is the activity workplace design. figure out the functions, figure out the flow of work, figure out the ratios, and then allow teams to determine which venues will best support their work. That comes the closest to me. And I'm not a designer, so I don't know kind of the future of that. But to me, I've seen that work the best.
Thank you. I'm going to throw two questions at you, but are pretty much asking the same thing. How could you use space as a tool for culture where many companies are switching a huge part of their teams to remote work? Another one, isn't the case more people are now working in a remote workspace rather than a physical workspace? And that is where culture needs to be tackled. Are employees not thinking enough about the nature of that remote workspace?
So if we were tackling this as a research project, and I think it's a great research project, one of the things we would do is get to the underlying root challenge of distributed work and cohesion. So when you're thinking about culture, what does culture actually do for you? It lets you know how to make decisions if a manager's not there. It lets you know how we treat each other. It lets you know the priorities that we make decisions by. So it's that invisible thread so that you don't need a physical manager to tell you. So if that's the key, or if that's some of the essence of culture, then we need to look at what do we lose when we go to this distributed model. The research would then be, if we want people to have some sense of synchronization, tuning, the ability to be like a jazz ensemble together in remote areas, what we would look at are examples. The music industry, how do they now collaborate on creating music? We would look at outliers who are creating highly creative, collaborative efforts together and begin to test what that might look like in our organization.
Rex, this has been fascinating. We're 5 minutes to the hour. We're trying to give people a break before that next meeting.
Excellent.
We will, Rex, I hope you don't mind if we share your email that people can contact you afterwards as well.
Absolutely.
But thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for that. What I am disappointed is you didn't say the words crusty middle, the crusty middle management, which I've been using that term when I heard it from you a while ago. But one of our biggest challenges in all of that is I kind of look at myself here, the over 60, that kind of crusty middle management level that hears all these great plans that the top leaders have and go, hang on, I'm not too sure if I'm keen on that. But I love that crusty middle management thing, that I'll continue to use it.
Well, you can use that because that describes the 82% of those task-oriented managers that just want to check it off the list. And so that now you've got a number to put behind that crusty middle.
Thank you very much, Rex. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Just to remind you, as you leave and you close, you will be taken to a website. So if you could give us your feedback and give Rex incredibly high marks, we'll double his bonus.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Some great insights. We will be sharing the recording afterwards as well. Thank you, and I look forward to chatting to you again. And your applause is the thank yous in the chat box now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Herman Miller.